Let's rewind to 1925, when Germany was a broken nation, its economy in ruins, its borders shrinking. The Weimar Republic had just collapsed, and the country was a shadow of its former self. But in the shadows, a new ideology was taking root. Adolf Hitler, a man obsessed with the purity of the Aryan race, saw war not as a means of conquest, but as a sacred duty. To him, the Lebensraum, the living space, was the key to Germany's survival. It wasn't just about land, it was about dominance, about erasing the inferior races that stood in the way of a new, Aryan utopia. This vision wasn't born in a vacuum. It was the culmination of centuries of European imperialism, of the belief that some peoples were naturally superior to others. Hitler wasn't just a dictator, he was a prophet of a new world order, one that would be built on the ashes of the old. But how did this ideology translate into action? The plan was audacious. The Generalplan Ost, as it was called, was a masterstroke of strategic terror. It envisioned the Soviet Union as a vast, untapped resource, a land of fertile soil and endless labor. The goal was simple: to conquer, to exterminate, to colonize. The Eastern Front became the stage for this apocalyptic vision. By 1940, Nazi Germany had expanded its territory from 469,000 square kilometers under the Weimar Republic to 824,000 square kilometers under the Third Reich. But this was just the beginning. The war would take them further, to the Ural Mountains, to the heart of Russia. The plan wasn't just about land, it was about control. Every inch of territory was a step toward a new world, a world where the Aryan race would reign supreme. Yet, the Nazis' ambitions were not limited to the East. They had their eyes on France, on the Balkans, on the entire continent of Europe. The invasion of France in 1940 was a masterclass in military strategy, but it was also a warning. The Nazis weren't just fighting for territory, they were fighting for dominance. Every conquered land was a step closer to their vision of a new world. But their plans were not without flaws. The war in the East was a disaster. The Soviet Union, with its vast resources and sheer numbers, proved to be an insurmountable obstacle. The Nazis' initial victories in the early days of Operation Barbarossa were a mirage, a fleeting illusion that masked the reality of their situation. The geography of the Eastern Front, the sheer size of the Soviet population, and the brutal winter all worked against them. But even with these challenges, the Nazis pressed on. The Holocaust was not an afterthought, it was a central pillar of their ideology. The final solution was not just a policy, it was a war against humanity itself. The camps, the gas chambers, the mass graves, these were not just acts of cruelty, they were acts of ideological purity. The Nazis believed they were saving the world from the degenerate races that had plagued it for centuries. To them, the Holocaust was a necessary evil, a means to an end. Every person they killed was a step closer to their vision of a new world. But what if they had succeeded? What if the Nazis had won the war, if the Holocaust had not been stopped? The consequences would have been unimaginable. The world as we know it would have been rewritten. The United States, the Soviet Union, the British Empire, these powers would have been replaced by a single, authoritarian regime. The Holocaust would have been the first step in a global purge, a systematic eradication of all who did not fit the Nazi vision of a master race. The world would have been divided into two, the Aryan territories, and the inferior lands, where the survivors would be forced into labor camps or exterminated. But the Nazis' victory was not guaranteed. Their strategic mistakes, their overreach, and their inability to adapt to the realities of war all played a role in their eventual defeat. The war in the East was a disaster, and the war in the West was a gamble that nearly failed. The Allies, despite their own weaknesses, managed to hold the line. The resistance in occupied Europe, the sabotage of Nazi infrastructure, the courage of those who refused to accept the Third Reich's vision of the world, all of these factors contributed to the Nazis' downfall. Yet, even in defeat, the Nazis' vision was not entirely extinguished. The Cold War that followed was a direct consequence of their failure. The United States and the Soviet Union, two nations born from the ashes of the Nazi regime, became the world's superpowers. The ideological battle between capitalism and communism was, in many ways, a continuation of the same struggle that had defined the 20th century. The Nazis' dream of a world order based on racial purity was replaced by a different kind of tyranny, one that would shape the next half-century of global politics. But what if the Cold War had taken a different turn? What if the Nazis had not been defeated, but had instead transformed into a new global power? The implications are staggering. The world would have been divided into two spheres of influence, with the Nazis controlling the East and the Allies controlling the West. The Holocaust would have been the first step in a global genocide, a systematic eradication of all who did not fit the Nazi vision of a master race. The world as we know it would have been rewritten, and the consequences would have been unimaginable. The question that haunts historians and theorists alike is this: what if the Nazis had won? Imagine a world where the Axis powers emerged victorious, reshaping the globe into two dominant spheres, the Nazi East, a vast empire stretching from the Urals to the Atlantic, and the Allied West, a coalition of Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union, bound by a fragile truce. The Holocaust, far from being a localized atrocity, would have evolved into a global campaign of extermination. The Nazis' vision of a master race would have extended beyond Europe, targeting populations deemed inferior across the world. The genocide would have been mechanized, leveraging advanced technology to accelerate the eradication of millions. In this alternate reality, the United Nations might never have formed, and the concept of human rights as we know it would have been obliterated. But the consequences of such a victory would have extended far beyond the Holocaust. The Nazi regime, with its obsession with racial purity and territorial expansion, would have sought to dominate the entire globe. The Soviet Union, if it had survived, would have been a vassal state, forced to comply with Nazi ideology. The United States and Britain, though allies, would have faced an existential threat from a Nazi-controlled Europe, leading to a prolonged and brutal Cold War. The atomic bomb, developed by the Allies, might have been used earlier, or perhaps the Nazis would have harnessed their own scientific advancements to create weapons of mass destruction. The world would have been a patchwork of authoritarian regimes, where propaganda, surveillance, and state control were the norm. The very idea of democracy, as we know it, would have been a relic of the past. Yet, even in this grim scenario, there would have been resistance. The Allies' defeat in 1945 might have sparked a global underground movement, with resistance fighters, scientists, and dissidents working to dismantle the Nazi regime from within. The discovery of the Holocaust's full scale could have galvanized a worldwide anti-fascist coalition, leading to a different kind of Cold War, one fought not just for ideology, but for the survival of humanity. However, the scars of such a conflict would have been profound. The world would have been divided, with no clear borders between the Nazi East and the Allied West. The Middle East, Africa, and Asia would have been battlegrounds for ideological struggle, with the Nazis seeking to impose their racial hierarchy on every continent. The modern implications of this alternate history are chilling. Today, the echoes of Nazi ideology persist in the form of far-right movements, ethnic cleansings, and the weaponization of propaganda. The Holocaust's legacy has shaped international law, with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the Genocide Convention serving as safeguards against such atrocities. But in a world where the Nazis had won, these protections would have never existed. The global order would have been defined by fear, not freedom. The rise of authoritarian regimes in the 20th century, from Stalinist USSR to Maoist China, might have been seen as necessary steps toward a unified, racially pure world. The concept of multiculturalism, as we know it, would have been anathema. Yet, the story of this alternate history also serves as a warning. The Nazis' defeat was not just a victory for democracy, it was a triumph for the idea that humanity could choose a different path. Today, the fight against authoritarianism, racism, and genocide remains as urgent as ever. The lessons of the Holocaust must be remembered, not as a distant tragedy, but as a call to action. The world we live in is shaped by the choices made in the darkest hours of the 20th century, but the future is still ours to shape. What do you think about this? Let us know in the comments below. If you found this valuable, hit the like button, subscribe to DSR, and turn on notifications. See you in the next video.